the selfless bravery of those health workers on the front line, our scientists working tirelessly to develop a vaccine, and all those quiet Australians who are diligently following the medical advice and playing their part in defeating this relentless and insidious enemy. This is the source of our hope and our strength that we will get through this. It is our resolve and resilience that will see Australians through. 2 world wars and a depression didn't bring Australia to its knees, and COVID will not either. Today, I'm going to talk about where we are from a health and economic perspective and outline the scale of the challenge we face and the uncertainty it brings. I'm also going to explain the steps we have taken and will take as part of our plan to support Australians through the depth of this crisis and help them back into work. Around 4 weeks ago, on the 23rd of June, Australia recorded 20 new COVID-19 cases. Yesterday, in my home state of Victoria, we had over 20 times that number. Over 5 million Victorians are back in lockdown. And it's a painful reminder of how quickly the virus can spread and the consequences that flow. However, we need to remember that 6 out of our 8 states and territories have had almost no cases and no community transmission. We must keep a sense of perspective. In Australia, as of today, there are 175 active cases for every million people, whereas in the United Kingdom, it's 3,774 and 7,998 in the United States. Our success on the health front has been due to an early and decisive move to close the international borders, to strengthen our health system and to put in place the right health measures. But we are under no illusions. And this is why we must continue to support efforts to develop a vaccine. There are over 140 vaccine candidates in development around the world, with 24 of these currently in human clinical trials, including 4 here in Australia. The Morrison government has invested $333 million to support these efforts. But as long as there is no vaccine, there will be new cases and outbreaks. How effectively we manage these cases and minimise the economic impact will determine the speed and the trajectory of our national economic recovery. The economic mountain we must climb is steep, with the release of the update yesterday making it clear. Record falls in household consumption, business investment and GDP, with the official unemployment rate to peak in the December quarter at 9.25%. As the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister and I have observed, given the dislocation in the labour market caused by the pandemic, it is the effective unemployment rate rather than the official unemployment rate that currently provides the best indicator of progress in getting Australians back into work. The effective unemployment rate takes into account those people who have left the labour force since March and those who have been stood down. And as we saw from the most recent labour force figures, 210,000 additional people found a job. In addition, a further 130,000 people who are employed but were temporarily stood down found work last month. As a result, the effective unemployment rate fell from its peak of close to 15% in April to 11.3% in June. The shock that we are seeing from the coronavirus is considerably sharper than what Australia experienced during the recessions of the 1980s and 1990s. The falls in GDP and employment are around twice as big and occurred over a matter of months, not years. In those earlier recessions, the impacts were felt more acutely by working-age men in the manufacturing and agricultural sectors. This time round, women have experienced higher job losses than men. Young people have also been badly affected, making up more than 1/3 of the jobs lost. The youth unemployment rate has jumped to its highest rate in 20 years. Since February of this year, the economic impact of COVID-19 has cost us 3.5 years' worth of accumulated GDP growth and around 3 years of hard-won employment growth. All gone through no fault of our own. Australia's position is not unique. COVID-19 is striking many economies with even more devastating consequences. The World Bank expects more economies to experience contractions in per capita GDP terms than at any other time since 1870. The OECD is forecasting a contraction of 6% in global growth this calendar year, compared to an annual fall of just 0.1% during the GFC. Global working hours lost in the March and the June quarters, according to the International Labour Organization, are equivalent to the loss of 480 million full-time jobs. In the United States, data overnight shows that there are now 53 million jobless claims since March. I know it will be of little comfort right now to those Australians who have lost their jobs. But Australia is the only developed country to have its growth forecast upgraded for 2020 by the IMF in its June World Economic Outlook. And this gives us confidence that we are better placed than most other nations to chart a path to recovery. In response to COVID-19, we have laid out a comprehensive plan. We moved quickly and decisively to slow COVID-19 spreading in Australia. We did this by closing our borders and imposing a set of restrictions that would suppress transmission, but allowing large parts of the economy to continue operating. This was a deliberate strategy. We didn't go down the path of countries like Sweden, which put few restrictions in place. The result is that Sweden has seen over 5,600 deaths from a population less than half the size of Australia's, while still experiencing large falls in economic activity. At the same time, we didn't go down the path of countries like France, which adopted extreme lockdowns, totally shutting down large parts of their economy. As a result, they have seen a huge collapse in economic activity of around 30%, with some sectors, including construction, down by almost 90%. Notwithstanding these measures, France still suffered around 450 deaths for every million people. The French Prime Minister has recently said that they would not be imposing a lockdown like the one they did in March again, because they have learned, and I quote, that the economic and human consequences from a total lockdown are disastrous. Instead, Australia chose a middle path, and we got the balance right. We have been clear from the outset that we are following a suppression strategy, not an elimination strategy. A strict elimination strategy would cripple our economy and require us to shut down many more sectors and not allow anyone to enter the country. Treasury, using OECD estimates of the economic impact of full lockdowns, suggests a 6-week Australia-wide hard lockdown could reduce GDP by around $50 billion. This is what is at stake. In contrast, we've shown that an aggressive suppression strategy targeting low or no community transmission can be effective when implemented well. And we have already seen this occur in 7 out of our 8 states and territories. The Victorian government has acknowledged that there were breakdowns in their quarantine arrangements that led to this new breakout. Provided we learn from the mistakes that have been made, we can get back to where we all want to be as a country. And we can keep our economy moving at the same time. As COVID-19 started to spread, we also took every step necessary to strengthen and prepare our health system, committing $9.4 billion towards the overall health response. This was used for the urgent purchase of personal protective equipment and other essential equipment to build the capacity of our hospital network, to provide Medicare subsidised telehealth services and to boost mental health supports across the community. Of course, even with these steps, the damage to our economy and to jobs could never have been completely avoided. And that is why we have committed a record $289 billion of economic support, of 14.6% of GDP, $164 billion of which is direct fiscal support, and another $125 billion in loans and guarantees and support with the Reserve Bank. Carefully designed to cushion the blow for households, help businesses stay in business and maintain financial stability. Of our direct measures, around $70 billion of support has already been provided. And Australia's fiscal response has been in line with that of other countries around the world, with around $11 trillion being deployed globally to mitigate the economic fallout from the pandemic. The centrepiece of our support measures has been the JobKeeper payment. It has acted as a lifeline for over 3.5 million people and nearly 1 million Australian businesses. And so far, this program has provided payments totalling over $30 billion, providing a much-needed boost to individuals, businesses and the economy. There are thousands of personal stories around the country, like Ashley, who runs an audio-visual business in Adelaide. As thousands of dollars of bookings were cancelled due to the pandemic, JobKeeper, in her words, acted as glue for her and her employees, allowing her to keep staff on and upskill the technical crew with in-house training. While Peter from Flinders Island Aviation in Tasmania used JobKeeper to keep his 4 staff employed as he provided essential passenger, freight and logistics support to isolated communities. Without JobKeeper and our other measures, the unemployment rate would have been 5 percentage points higher than we have seen. It has saved 700,000 jobs. And like so many of our other measures, JobKeeper has been helping lower income households. Around 80% of those people receiving JobKeeper in May were earning less than $90,000 a year before the crisis. On top of this, we provided direct support to those low-income households who needed it most, including Social Security, veteran and other income support payments recipients. Our $750 economic support payment in April provided $5.6 billion to over 7 million people, and our July payment is providing another $3.8 billion to around 5 million people. Like Jenny from Malang in South Australia, who sent me a heartfelt letter just last week, describing herself as a widowed 83-year-old renting pensioner. She shared how in 1 week the power bill arrived, her 19-year-old washing machine packed up, and her adopted greyhound had a tragic accident, leaving her with a $260 vet bill. In her words, suddenly your money arrived, I paid my bills, it was perfect timing. Jenny, like so many others across the community, has benefited from the support that has been put in place. And other measures include our $550 coronavirus supplement, which has significantly increased support for over 1.6 million job seekers. The coronavirus supplement is also being provided to around 600,000 other beneficiaries, including those on the parenting payment. And we have also allowed those who have lost their jobs or suffered a large drop in their hours to access their superannuation early and tax-free, providing further financial relief. It is, after all, their money. We know that almost 60% of those accessing their super early have used it or plan to use it to meet essential day-to-day expenses, including paying down debts, with another 36% adding to the money to their savings. We've also provided targeted support to help businesses survive this crisis, retain their employees and invest for the future. Our Boosting Cash Flow for Employers measure has provided over $17 billion to more than 750,000 businesses across Australia. Some have used this support to help cover their rent or their running costs. Some have used it to replenish their stock levels. Others have used it to hire or retain staff. Treasury analysis shows that without the various support measures provided to businesses, including JobKeeper, the cash flow boost, and rent and loan deferrals, another 200,000 businesses would likely have run out of cash by the end of this year. This unprecedented level of cash flow support was coupled with incentives for businesses to invest in their future to make them more competitive and more resilient. And this included a 50% accelerated depreciation measure, as well as a significantly expanded instant asset write-off. During the crisis, we've also made more than 80 regulatory changes to provide greater flexibility and protections for affected businesses. And while our focus has been on providing support to businesses across the whole economy, we recognise that restrictions have impacted some sectors more than others. This is why we have supplemented our broad-based support with targeted sector-specific responses. Take the Home Builder program, which is already boosting activity and jobs in the residential construction market. In June, sales of new houses jumped by almost 80%, and the Master Builders Association has said the scheme is delivering the most effective stimulus in a decade. Consider the specific support provided to the arts and entertainment sector, with $250 million in grants and loans that will support thousands of jobs and a further $400 million to attract film and television productions to Australia. Just as we have done to date, as part of our JobMaker plan, we will continue to evaluate the need for further targeted specific support as the crisis evolves. Credit is the lifeblood of our economy. Had it stopped flowing, it would have triggered an even more severe economic shock than the one we're experiencing. And that is why the third part of our economic plan was focused on making sure that we protected our financial system and kept credit flowing through the economy. We did this with the Reserve Bank, our other financial regulators, and in close and constructive partnership with the major banks. And thanks to this partnership, since March of this year, banks have provided repayment deferrals on over 900,000 loans, covering in excess of $250 billion in borrowings. The RBA established a new term funding facility, providing incentives for banks to increase lending to businesses, particularly SMEs. Similar measures were introduced to enable the Australian Office of Financial Management to support smaller bank and non-bank lenders, with the government providing $15 billion to support their ability to lend. To date, around 16,000 loans worth $1.6 billion have been accepted under the first phase of our SME guarantee scheme. And the government is extending and enhancing the scheme as its focus turns to helping businesses recover and grow as the economy continues to open up. The results are clear to see. Credit has continued to flow. According to ABA data, the four major banks increased their total lending to SMEs by $2.2 billion in June. Taken together, our policy measures have been temporary, they've been targeted, and they have been scalable. They have been effective and achieved what they were designed to do: keep businesses afloat, keep people in jobs, maintain financial system stability and the flow of credit. But now we move to the next phase of support. And with restrictions starting to ease across much of the country and parts of our economy reopening, we move to the JobMaker plan. Despite the challenges in Victoria, there are positive signs that large parts of our economy are starting to get back to business. We are seeing this across a range of indicators. On the jobs front, of the 1.3 million Australians who lost their job or who were stood down on 0 hours at the start of the crisis, close to 500,000 had again started some form of work in June. Around half of this recovery was in the accommodation, the food and the retail sectors. If secondary outbreaks are contained, Treasury expects around half of those that lost their jobs or who were stood down on 0 hours early in the crisis will be back in some form of work by the end of the year. Of course, we know that some sectors will continue to be badly affected. In transport, for example, a key industry tied to international tourism, there is yet to be a recovery in jobs lost or the number of workers who have been stood down on 0 hours. There are encouraging signs also from the early bank data with respect to loan deferrals. As of June, repayments are now being made either in full or in part on over 20% of those deferred housing loans. As the economic environment evolves, so too must our economic plan to match these changing circumstances. The initial phase of our plan was focused on preparing our health system for this crisis, saving jobs and protecting the economy. The next phase of this crisis, our focus will shift to enabling growth. Because unlike past recessions, monetary policy is constrained and will do much less of the heavy lifting. During the GFC, the Reserve Bank cut interest rates by 425 basis points. Today, this would be the equivalent of up to $100 billion in fiscal support over a 12-month period. I repeat, during the GFC, the Reserve Bank cut interest rates by 425 basis points. This would be the equivalent of $100 billion of fiscal support over a 12-month period. We simply don't have that luxury this time round. We also don't have a strong flow of migrants to support growth. Due to lower net overseas migration, annual population growth is assumed to slow to just 0.6% in 2021, the lowest rate since 1916-17. This time, while we will continue to provide fiscal support through the crisis, sustainable growth will only come from creating the most dynamic and the most flexible economy we possibly can. And this is what our JobMaker plan is all about. And that is how we can get Australians back into work as quickly as possible. As we announced earlier this week, the JobKeeper payment will be extended for a further 6 months. This will give those businesses additional time to recover while encouraging those that can reopen to do so. Treasury estimates that between 1 million and 1.4 million people will continue receiving JobKeeper at an additional cost of around $17 billion. Importantly, JobKeeper will remain open to new participants, and if conditions worsen or restrictions become tighter, more people will become eligible and get the support they need. While we are seeing early signs of a recovery in the jobs market, the unemployment rate will remain high for some time. So we're also extending the temporary coronavirus supplement to the end of the year. And at the same time, we are making sure that there are strong incentives in the system for job seekers to take up new job opportunities as quickly as possible by increasing the income-free area and simplifying the taper rate. Individuals will now be able to earn nearly 3 times as much, up to $300 per fortnight, before they lose any job seeker payment. We know that the job market will be tighter for new job seekers and graduates. Treasury analysis shows that Australians graduating into a labour market with high youth unemployment can expect to earn roughly 8% less in their first year of work and 3.5% less after 5 years. The new National Skills Commission will help young job seekers to better understand the skill needs of employers and target investments to the skills and jobs that will be in demand. We have worked with the states to deliver $80 million for 80,000 additional vet short course places in priority areas like infection control training. Our higher education relief package introduced subsidised short courses to help Australians upskill or retrain in critical areas like nursing, teaching and science. And we're establishing a $1 billion job trainer fund jointly funded with the states and the territories, which will provide up to 340,000 vocational education and training places for school leavers and job seekers in 2020-21. We've also extended our 50% wage subsidy for existing apprentices and trainees to the 31st of March next year and expanded eligibility to medium-sized businesses. The extension will help 90,000 small and medium-sized businesses and around 180,000 apprentices and trainees stay in work and prevent them from losing a year of their training. These opportunities will not be fully realised unless we deal with our inflexible industrial relations system. The temporary industrial relations changes we have made in response to the crisis have been absolutely critical to keeping more people in work. Early survey results of the use of these provisions indicate businesses have found the changes to be essential to their ability to adjust and get through these challenging times. 3 out of 4 surveyed employers used the flexibilities provided for by the provisions. Almost all surveyed employers that used the flexibilities have said such access was important to keep their business operating and their employees in jobs. And 80% of surveyed employers support the continuation of the JobKeeper flexibilities for a further period of time, with job losses and business closure being the most commonly cited impact of not being able to use the provisions into the future. These temporary changes have shown us how big an impact a more flexible system can have. There is no doubt that our industrial relations system is overly complex and rigid. For the system to deliver more jobs, it will need to evolve to meet the jobs challenge the country faces. And this is the reason why the work that the Attorney-General is leading is so integral to the recovery, and why all parties must constantly ask themselves, will the changes they seek create more jobs or less? That is the critical question for all participants. Our tax system will also need to play a role in the recovery. The pathway to recovery is not through higher taxes, but through a more competitive and efficient tax system that supports jobs and promotes investment. The Morrison government is already driving reform in this area by abolishing an entire income tax bracket and delivering the largest personal income tax cuts in more than 20 years. Over months, our legislated tax cuts will see, according to Treasury and the ATO, over $7 billion flow into the pockets of taxpayers as millions of Australians lodge their income tax returns. And during this crisis, we've also prioritised tax changes that support business investment and will continue to do so, because there cannot be any sustained recovery without new investment. I am encouraged by the early discussions I'm having with the state and territory treasurers about tax issues at our Council of Federal Financial Relations meetings. We all recognise there is a need and an opportunity for reform in a very complex area with many moving parts. Our principles are agreed. We're all in favour of tax reform that delivers a simpler, more efficient and sustainable tax system as a pathway to more jobs and investment. As Treasurers, we've also been tasked by the National Cabinet to take the lead in cutting red tape. And one long overdue area of reform is to improve occupational mobility by reducing licensing and registration requirements between states. Currently, there are over 800 different licences in manual trades alone. Based on our recent discussions among Treasurers, we are well placed to make substantial progress on this issue very soon. We need to trust each other across the Federation. If an individual is licensed and registered in one jurisdiction, that should be easily recognised across the country. Another red tape priority reform is to tackle planning and zoning and push forward with long overdue changes. As the Productivity Commission has reported, these reforms could unlock around $1 billion of economic activity each year in Sydney alone. And this is what practical changes can do to help businesses grow. Ladies and gentlemen, the government has been able to respond to this crisis with unprecedented levels of economic support following 6 years of fiscal repair and discipline. This fiscal support, together with parameter variations, which are seeing higher welfare payments and decreased tax receipts, is having a major impact on our budget position. This was unavoidable. The underlying cash deficit is now expected to be $85.8 billion, or 4.3% of GDP in 1920, increasing to $184.5 billion, or 9.7% of GDP in 2020-21. These are daunting figures. These are eye-watering figures and reveal the impact on the budget of COVID-19. Government debt levels have increased sharply, with net debt expected to reach $667 billion, or 35.7% of GDP at the end of June next year. But even at these levels, our net debt to GDP ratio is significantly below that of comparable countries, with the average net debt to GDP ratio of many advanced economies expected to exceed 100% in 2020. Notwithstanding our relatively strong position, we remain focused on protecting the structural integrity of the budget, with almost 99% of the spending committed in response to the crisis occurring over just 2 years, 1920 and 2021. As our economy recovers, so too will our budget position. And with historically low interest rates, our debt levels remain manageable. The weighted average cost of our new borrowing assumed in this update is only around 0.8%, down from around 2.8% only 2 years ago in the 18-19 budget. Growing our economy will be a key to reducing our debt as a share of GDP. Let me illustrate this. With the benefit of low interest rates, returning to trend growth, and bringing the budget back to balance, we will see our gross debt as a share of GDP reduced by around 1.5 percentage points per year. So as you grow the economy faster than your debt levels are rising, you can reduce your debt to GDP ratio. We have demonstrated that we can run a balanced budget before, and we will do it again. Just as growth will be key to getting more Australians back into work, so too it will underpin our fiscal repair strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, this is a difficult time for Australians. It will test many of us like we have never been tested before. No one should underestimate the size of the mountain that we have to climb. But we can be confident that as a nation we have the ability to manage these challenges and we have the plan to do it. Underpinning the recovery has been a strong spirit of collaboration right across the country. From the Commonwealth and the states and the territories through the new National Cabinet. From our big cities to our small towns. From businesses to the unions and the banks. Australians have come together to tackle this crisis. And if we continue to work together in the spirit of cooperation that we have shown in our response to date, we will emerge stronger. There is hope for the future.